Hello and welcome to Reporters here in France 24. I'm Mark Owen. In this edition, we're taking you back in time. Marseille, 1943. World War II is raging. The Nazis have been occupying the city for several months. January, almost 80 years ago to the exact day, in the Old Port area, Marseille's historic heart, resistance is starting to stir up and a number of operations are already planned. There were many Italians in this quarter who had fled the Mussolini regime, union organisers, communists, as well as Jews. Groups of course, despised by Hitler and the Nazis. And they decided to make an example of Marseille, forcing deportations. The quarter was then flattened. 1,500 buildings were destroyed, 50 streets wiped out. Today's descendants of those who were persecuted back then are calling for all this to be recognised as a crime against humanity. Marseille, 1943, a forgotten crime. A report by Florence Gaillard and Georges Yazbek.
Behind me is Marseille's City Hall, which dates from the 17th century, one of the last vestiges of the neighbourhood, the Saint-Jean district, which was destroyed by the Nazis in 1943. The buildings which directly face the port were built in 1955, where the old buildings once stood. Some 50 streets disappeared in the heart of Marseille, where the first citizens of the city lived.
That's me, and there's my dad. I'm about 3 years old. You can see it says barber.
He was a shoemaker, your father.
He was both in Sicily. He learned both trades, shoemaker and barber. My parents left Sicily in 1922, driven out by Mussolini and by the fascism in Italy at the time. I was an only child, born on the 24th of November 1937 at 66 Rue Saint-Laurent in Marseille.
My name is Fernand Ribéry. I was born on January 18, 1950, and I'm the grandson of Francesco Commentale, who died in a concentration camp in Germany. My grandfather was Italian and worked clearing salt deposits from the hulls of ships. He had 6 children, and he lived with his family at 16 Rue de la Reynard, in what was known at the time as Marseille's prostitution district.
It was a very working-class neighborhood. The streets were our playground. I remember the small, narrow streets. There was a gutter in the center of the street where we used to have races using paper or corks. We may have been poor, but we were happy.
I was born in Marseille, in what is now called the Old Port district. My mum was from Greece. My father was from Istanbul. And they arrived in France at a young age, and they were naturalized shortly after their arrival. They lived on the Rue de la Rose, where the 3 of us were born, my brother, my sister and me. It didn't take long for them to start a successful small business. My mother was also interested in trade and selling clothes. It was a neighborhood where people helped each other a lot, really populated by immigrants.
The Germans occupied Marseille on November the 11th, 1942. They crossed the demarcation line to face the Allies who had landed in North Africa. On January 3rd, 1943, there were armed acts of resistance at the Hotel Splendide and in some brothels in the city. Hitler was furious about what was happening in Marseille, and he said it must, at all costs, serve as an example. For the Germans, what was happening in these neighbourhoods was the very antithesis of Nazism. They even used the term dump of Europe, describing it as a place of total degeneration. In a telegram, Hitler himself defined the objectives of Operation Sultan, calling for the destruction of these districts by blowing up the homes with the inhabitants inside.
En faisant sauter les habitants dans leur domicile.
The French authorities, in particular René Bousquet, protested by saying that the Marseillais cannot be just blown up in their homes. But at the same time, the Vichy state was collaborating with the Nazis.
On January 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, 1943, the French Vichy government, along with the Nazis, emptied the neighborhoods, forcing some 25,000 people out of their homes. They did this with the help of large numbers of French police officers who were brought in from across France. 12,000 officers came in to evacuate the old port. On the morning of January 24th, 1943, vehicles with loudspeakers were crisscrossing the district with the terrible message: evacuate your homes, take some belongings and enough food for 48 hours, and lock up when you leave.
That night, I was asleep. Of course, at 6 a.m., being a kid, I was sleeping. My mum woke me up to say, "Hurry, get dressed. We have to go, we have to go." Immediately, I saw the expressions on my parents' faces. They were full of fear and anxiety. That really stayed with me. Once we left the apartment, with everyone else leaving the neighborhood, we were in the street being guarded by the French police. We were taken down Rue Saint-Laurent and taken to the port. We were like a flock of sheep, and no one reacted. Because if it was the Germans who had come knocking at the door, we certainly would have resisted.
The day before, a friend of my parents came to visit and told my father, "Isidore, they're coming to get the Jews in the neighborhood, but also at the opera, and you should go away and hide for a while." He did not say anything about destruction. He wasn't aware of that. My father held a family meeting to discuss it, and he decided not to take the warning seriously, saying, "They're after the Jews much further north in France." Then the roundup began. My father, his brother-in-law, we never saw them again. We never saw them again.
On ne reverra pas. On ne reverra pas.
At the port, on the Quai Maréchal Pétain, there was a large number of buses and trams waiting. 15,000 of the 25,000 inhabitants of the district were taken to Aronc, which was a train station near the port where they sorted people. Then they were sent to the Fréjus military camp. There, using French files of information, the German military created a screening process. They identified the Jews, political opponents, communists, and young people. We don't know exactly why young people were targeted, outside of needing laborers in the German concentration camps.
We were put in unsanitary barracks with no beds, just straw and full of bugs and vermin. And that's what we had to sleep on.
The fathers were separated from the mothers and the children. My mother used to say that my grandfather came to see her every evening to bring her grilled pine nuts to give to her brothers and sisters.
After a week, we were told to get ready, that we were going back to Marseille.
My grandmother returned with her 6 children. We don't know what happened to my grandfather. We were told week after week that he would return, but he never did. After a while, we had to face the fact that he had disappeared.
Fortunately, those who were not deported from Fréjus were allowed to return to Marseille, but most arrived too late. The destruction had already begun. They would never see their homes again or recover any of their property.
Au total,
1,500 buildings were destroyed over 14 hectares. 50 streets disappeared from the map between the 1st and 17th of February 1943. In the evening, there were explosions, and during the day, they cleared up.
There were some who spoke up and challenged what was happening. Father Cayol wrote several letters to Marshal Pétain's office. There was even a pastor who was deported for protesting. And meanwhile, on the whole, the population was terrified, saying, they started with the poor, but where will they stop?
There was an office where you could find information on people who were caught. My mother left with a very large sum of money in her bag. She was convinced that by paying, she would be able to find her husband and the rest of the family who were taken away. But it didn't happen like that, and we never saw her again. She stayed in Drancy for 2 months. My father was taken in January, and he died very quickly in March. My mother stayed 2 months in Drancy, and she wrote letters from there. What is amazing is that in both cases, when they arrived in the camp, one Sobibor, the other Auschwitz, between the day of their arrival and the day of their deaths, only 6 days passed.
In January of 2019, I filed a criminal complaint alleging crimes against humanity on behalf of 4 survivors and 4 descendants of the victims, because the French and the Nazis conspired together, systematically targeting a group of civilians, namely those who lived within a perimeter that was determined in advance. This resulted in death, deportation, forced transfers, destruction, loss of property. All of this meets the very definition of crimes against humanity.
We lost the roof over our heads, our home, and the barber's shop, our livelihood. It was a tragedy, the beginning of a terrible misery for us because we had nothing. We were poor as dirt, as they say.
Francesco, on a su a posteriori qu'il avait été.
We later learned that my grandfather was chosen to be part of a convoy of about 800 people sent to Compiègne, and in April finally to a concentration camp in Oranienburg, in Germany.
Camp de concentration à Oranienburg, en Allemagne. Voilà.
My belief is that he was working in politics or with the unions, and that's why he was targeted by the Germans.
There's my mother, Maurice, Jacqueline, and me. That's my brother and my sister who survived. Me and my mother, who disappeared, and whom I never knew. So when I see myself with those blonde curls sitting on her lap, I say to myself, yes, you knew her, but what memories do you have of her? None. I think she's really pretty.
Our report, Marseille 1943 by Florence Gaillard and Georges Yazbek. You can, of course, see it again on the website france24.com. This is Reporters on France 24. Stay with us. Most of all, stay safe.